Hey there everyone, my name is Jakejames Lugo, and welcome to the channel, where you'll find some of the most fair and honest game reviews out here.
Hello there.
And we're back on our Star Wars stuff, checking out a game from the early 2000s that came out after Episode 2 Attack of the Clones, the Clone Wars game for the PlayStation 2. Now this game is almost 20 plus years old, but was it still good to play through even though there was a lot of stuff that wasn't figured out back then? Well, let's find out. During the release of the prequel films, Star Wars hype was at an all-time high. We were in new territory with lots of potential for amazing stories and games set during the Clone Wars. But while we'd eventually get some interesting ones, this was not one of those good games. Star Wars The Clone Wars was released in 2002 for multiple consoles, a few months after the release of Episode 2 Attack of the Clones. It was developed by Pandemic, the same guys who would go on to later release the very first Star Wars Battlefront game a few years later. Anyway, the Clone Wars takes place at the end of Episode 2, starting at the battle with the Separatist droid army on Geonosis. From there, you follow Mace Windu, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Anakin Skywalker in a series of missions following the events of the movie. It honestly feels like the year one of the Clone Wars, with very little importance. There is a small plot about the Republic searching for a Sith weapon called the Dark Reaper, but it's meaningless after this game. I like that we get to see multiple planets during this era of Star Wars. It's the first time that we get to see planets like Kashyyyk within a video game. However, this game is not considered canon anymore, much like other Star Wars games of the time. The story of this game really isn't all that good. It doesn't give a lot of good plot details, at least ones that are significant that you would get from like the movies and other video games. However, the only other interesting aspect about this is that you get to play as a character like Mace Windu, which is something we don't see often. However, the problem with this is exactly that. We don't get to really play with Mace Windu all that much throughout the game. You probably play as him for a couple missions, both in a vehicle and on foot, and then you immediately switch over back to Obi-Wan and Anakin, which I don't have a problem with, but it would have been so much more interesting and probably a lot more fun to experience the Clone Wars from Mace Windu's perspective, since the majority of the stories we see are from the perspective of Anakin and probably Obi-Wan Kenobi. Other than that, this game is considered not canon, so anything that happens in here is completely irrelevant, especially if you're trying to keep in with the canon of the current Disney stuff with everything going on with Star Wars stories, so everything with this game doesn't really matter. So besides the story stuff, let's get into the gameplay because there's a lot more in here to discuss about that, which for some might be for better or for worse. Even though this game is the first real exploration of the Clone Wars during the prequel era in video game form, it's not as pretty as some might remember.
I have a bad feeling about this.
I've got a bad feeling about this.
I have a bad feeling about this.
I have a bad feeling about this.
Oh, I have a bad feeling about this.
Whether we like it or not, Star Wars The Clone Wars has a lot of problems. The visuals are very dated and don't look as good compared to other Star Wars games of that era. The gameplay is primarily vehicular combat, with a little bit of on-foot Jedi action. But it's all ruined by the sluggish controls, along with a myriad of technical problems in every mission. Most of the time, you'll be in a tank or small vehicle battling groups of Trade Federation droids, with the occasional boss fight here and there. All of it honestly feels like bantha fodder, dull and mediocre. It can be hard to maneuver around the battlefields in critical moments. Most enemies are weak to lasers, but a good chunk of them will require missiles to do some respectable damage. Everything becomes a problem when you're bombarded with multiple kinds of enemies that swarm you, only for things to get worse due to the game's poor hitboxes and bugs and glitches. Things can get very annoying very quickly, making what should be fun feel like total garbage.
I don't believe that. And you're sounding like a separatist.
So the controls of this game are very sluggish and can get very annoying to deal with, especially when you're outside of a vehicle and you're running around as a Jedi Knight fighting enemies. The controls kind of remind me a little bit of Star Wars Dark Forces or the Jedi Knight games in the way that they're designed for both first-person and third-person gameplay, but the controls in here and the way that the game plays out, it's definitely not as smooth as some of those other games. And then when you start fighting the different boss characters and the different boss fights you could run into, things can get very chaotic and super annoying because your reaction time and your movement around the battlefield is just not as smooth. It feels incredibly clunky, sluggish, and it could just get so maddening when you're getting bombarded with a bunch of attacks from groups of enemies. That could just not be fun to deal with. The boss fights that you run into at multiple points of the game can be very inconsistent at times, and I can't honestly tell you whether it's because of bugs and glitches or that's just the way they're designed, because some enemies will feel very overpowered and others will feel like pushovers, but again, it's never really consistent. It maybe has something to do with like the actual checkpoints or other things that are going on, but it just feels like there's a bunch of problems here. So with all those frustrations at work, is it still worth the trouble of going through all this stuff in order to get some good like extras or bonus material? Like, does at least this game have something to work towards? Now there are some extras outside of the campaign, but it's not much. The game has a multiplayer duel mode and arena mode, where you can take on waves of enemies on foot or battle against each other one-on-one. I briefly checked out both modes and they're as shallow as you might expect. You can unlock extra playable characters and maps for them by finishing the main campaign, but that's about it. There are also cheat codes to use for unlocking content and cheating within the main game, but that charm runs out pretty quickly. Most unlockables can be earned by completing a bunch of side missions during campaign missions, but to be honest with you, it's not worth the trouble to pacify the game's bigger issues. They could be tedious and not fun to deal with when you're trying to finish a mission.
Sir, one of the Techno-Union ships is taking off. We must destroy it before it leaves orbit.
My biggest issue with all of this stuff here is that while I understand you can unlock all these characters for these other game modes, you can't use any of them in the main campaign missions. I feel like that's a big missed opportunity because it would have been fun to take some of those game skins, like some of those characters, and use them in missions I've already completed. Why can't I do something like that? It also would have been really sweet to have bonus unlockable missions for some of these characters. I mean, you get people like a clone trooper, you can unlock Padme, you can unlock Yoda even if you do enough of the side quests. Why can't I get like, bonus missions that are like spin-offs of some of the main campaign stuff and play as them for a whole level? I feel like that would have probably been a lot of fun and a little bit of interesting stuff to add on to the plot, quote unquote, that you have for this game. But alas, as is, with all the extras that you get in here, it's kind of a mediocre package. Well, my young apprentice, what more can I say about this early 2000s prequel game? Can I recommend that you check out Star Wars: The Clone Wars for any console? My answer is no, absolutely not. The game is very outdated and not as good as other Star Wars games released around that time. If you're really interested in a Star Wars game featuring the Clone Wars, you're better off playing the vastly superior Star Wars Battlefront games. Those are the ones that Pandemic got right. You'll have a far better experience seeing the Clone Wars that way, and you'll avoid this bantha fodder. You're honestly not missing much by skipping over this one.
You were the chosen one! It was said that you would destroy the Sith, not join them! I hate you!
Well, there you go, everyone. Those are my thoughts about Star Wars: The Clone Wars for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube. I ended up playing the PlayStation 2 version for this review. Yeah, this game just isn't all that great. It's kind of bad, and it's a shame too because I don't like seeing bad Star Wars games. I think we all love playing good Star Wars games, and I understand that this was one of the first Clone Wars related games to come out after Attack of the Clones, but around that time frame, we had a bunch of other great Star Wars games that most people will probably enjoy far more than this one. And that's not even including some of the other Clone Wars related stuff we got later on, including the animated Clone Wars stuff, and of course, the Star Wars Battlefront games from Pandemic. But of course, like any other game that I review on this channel, that's just my thoughts about Star Wars: The Clone Wars. Let me know some of your thoughts about this game down below in the comments section. Tell me, are you a big Star Wars fan? Do you like the Star Wars video games that we have right now? What are some of your favorite characters from the Clone Wars era? Because there's so many out there from all the different shows and games and such. Talk to me about that stuff down below in the comments section. Thank you very much for watching this video, everyone. Like always, I appreciate all of you checking out the new videos and showing love to the channel. Make sure you subscribe and leave me a comment down below. It really helps out a ton. If you love Star Wars and reviews of video games, you'll want to keep checking back here on the channel every week for more new videos to watch. I'll have some more cool stuff for you all again real soon. Peace out and stay epic, everybody.